music?
Yeah, what is new music? One of those things where one answer is I know it when I see it, but, so I think it's impossible to really define it, but I'd say that usually new music is written by people who have some kind of conscious relationship to the European classical canon, keeping in mind that one type of relationship might be reacting against it. That's one way of having a relationship with it. It can be self-consciously intellectual or self-consciously unintellectual, which is again another way of being intellectual in my opinion. I mean, everybody probably will define it differently, and that's maybe one of the characteristics of it also, is that there are lots of different ways of defining it.
Yeah.
In a sense, one way I could describe it was that music wouldn't leave me alone. It was one of the things I got interested in fairly early during my childhood. That and also the sciences. Those were two things I kind of got interested in. And one thing that I found through a lot of my life was that I had these ideas of pieces of music, fragments of music, constantly churning in my brain. And sometimes it felt a bit like torture, like they wouldn't leave me alone. I actually first pursued the sciences, physics in particular, and from a fairly early time in my childhood, I thought that was going to be kind of my mission in life, and so I went with that for a long time, but it was these tunes kind of and fragments of sound kind of clawing at the inside of my head that eventually led me to go back to school, actually, because I felt that I was missing some ingredient, some bridge between what was inside my head and music that could be realized in the real world. I felt like I needed to learn more. And what I guess I didn't also, what I was only partly conscious of at first was that I also needed a pathway into the community of music makers. And that was another thing that formal study helped with, was it kind of gave me a pathway to meet other people who were interested in new music and to, kind of find a way into that community. Well, what is the day of a composer like really depends on which composer you ask. Some people really like to handwrite everything and prefer to work that way. Some people work directly with, say, a digital audio workstation, sort of directly sculpting the sound. I tend to work a lot with notation software and kind of use that as my pencil, as it were, and use that as my sketching medium. And I have other work besides composing, and so probably a lot of my typical day, since I'm still active as a teacher in the sciences and I do a lot of private tutoring, so a fair amount of my day is actually on Zoom calls with students explaining calculus or physics or whatever. But then for the parts where I'm actually composing, a lot of it is procrastinating, to be honest. And but while I'm procrastinating, of course, I'm usually thinking about what I'm supposed to be working on, which means it's not really unproductive time. It's a lot of times I'm doing something else but thinking about the piece that I am either working on or that I'm supposed to be working on. I tend to prefer to spend a few months on a piece. Sometimes it might be longer than that. Sometimes it might be more like a few years. It really depends on the piece. And it depends on the piece. It depends on when the deadline is. Deadlines are really good for me because they sort of force me to be a little bit less critical and just get stuff done. And sometimes that can be helpful for removing blocks. I mean, I think about this sometimes. Uh, at the best moments of both of them, they're two different ways of sharing an experience of beauty. My background as a physicist gives me certain habits of thinking and thinking about the relationship between abstract ideas and more concrete things. So thinking about how something as abstract as a physical law ends up getting manifested in our actual sensory experience day to day. And there's a similar process in thinking about music, that sometimes I start out by thinking very abstractly with music, but there are layers of translation between that abstraction and what you actually hear. And I'm really interested in the complexity of that relationship, between what's behind something and what the surface is. There also have been times when I've taken a bit more direct inspiration. So, for example, I once wrote a piece where I actually set excerpts of research papers to music, had a baritone singing excerpts of papers that basically told a story, and I was kind of trying to get across some of the drama that's actually behind this seemingly very dry text, right? I mean, research papers, they're not exactly an easy read, but there's actually a lot of drama behind that very dry text, and that's kind of what I was aiming to convey with the music to some extent. So that's one area. One piece that sort of surprised me in a way. So I created this piece for a trumpet player, Aaron Hodgson, and I used sound generated by a chaotic oscillator and just gradually adjusting a parameter of this oscillator and seeing the different patterns that could develop, and having the sound gradually evolve over about 6 minutes, and then wrote a trumpet part that kind of responds to this in a kind of quasi-improvisational way, but picking up on some of the pitches that pop out of the noisy texture once in a while. So it's an audio-visual piece where you're seeing a display of the waveform and hearing it at the same time, and that was a piece that kind of surprised me in a way by being one of the more successful things I've done in terms of getting interest from performers and getting multiple performances. Part of your job as a composer is to tell other people what to do. And so that is something that I had to make peace with, because that's something that doesn't come naturally to me in a way, right? And so I had to figure out a context in which I could do that in a way that was sort of true to myself, and that didn't feel controlling or too controlling, but was controlling in the ways that were necessary, right? And that fulfills, to some extent, when you're a composer, when you write a piece or you deliver a score, the performers are expecting some guidance from you. They're expecting that you know what you want. I've certainly had some performers who were maybe had more questions about what were you aiming for here. And I've also had situations where in a rehearsal I was hearing something where I thought, okay, that's really not what I had in mind, and and then I would sort of try to work with them to come up with some more mutually shared idea, right? there were some times where I'd hear something and realize, okay, that's not how I imagined it, but I like this better than how I imagined it. So there's always a certain, and I to some extent, I want there to be room for that to happen, for unexpected things to happen. And yet, you also need a certain amount of clarity. Like sometimes you really are looking for a particular thing, and you want to communicate that clearly as well, whether it's through the notation or by talking. And, how much of that comes across in the notation versus by conversation, that really kind of depends on the piece, on the performers, on how exactly the collaboration is working, how much time you have together, whether you're in the same room or they're across the continent or whatever. And so, yeah, getting some clarity on how that relationship works, that's a big part of the process for me, or that's been a big part of my development, I guess, is becoming a little bit more clear about when do I really want to be directive and when do I want things to be out of control a little bit. Well, okay. What are some impressions and insights? I guess I could go back to, what I was talking about a minute ago about some of these pieces that were more directly inspired by mathematics, that I found them to be almost more successful in reaching audiences than I kind of anticipated. And I find that sometimes the emotional impact of a performance can be different from what I expected when I was working on it, and that's great. I like discovering unexpected things like that. I found some pieces that unexpectedly turned out to be funny when they were performed, and I wasn't really viewing that way when I was working on them, but then in retrospect I realized, well, yeah, there was definitely a certain playfulness that's there. And going back to the piece that I mentioned, where I set research papers, I had a few people say that they found that funny, and I realized, well, yeah, of course it is, because that's not the kind of text you normally expect somebody to be singing. But then I had other people at the same performance say that they also felt that it conveyed something of this mystery of the order of the universe, kind of. And so I like when there's more than one interpretation of things. I guess I say the most successful music is when you can interpret it more than one way, and different people will have different reactions to it.